I'm Mariette DiCristina. I'm the Dean of Boston University's College of Communication. I'm also an alum of COM and the parent of a recent BU grad. Welcome to today's special COM Talks virtual event, Reporting While Black, Self-Care and Wellness for Journalists. This event is being recorded and the recording will be made available on COM's website after the event. Black journalists who report on race and policing suffer a serious and unrelenting mental toll. This strain is increased by a lack of diversity in newsrooms. What needs to change in newsrooms moving forward to better support Black journalists? And how can Black journalists report these critical and important stories without burning out or breaking down themselves? Today's event, which is co-sponsored by the college's Committee for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, will explore all these questions and more. Please remember to put your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat, and feel free to type in those questions whenever you're ready to do so. Now it's my genuine pleasure to introduce each of our speakers. I'll share all of their bios so you know their backgrounds, and then I'll introduce our wonderful moderator, Tina Martin. First up, I'd love to introduce you to Dr. Xenia Bhembe. Dr. Bhembe is a double board-certified senior psychiatrist in the Boston area with over 20 years of practice and assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard. She served in direct clinical care, medical, student education, and community outreach. She currently serves as the director of behavioral health at the Greater Lawrence Family Health Center. Dr. Bhembe has become known by a growing network of leaders in the Boston area committed to equity and cultural understanding for vulnerable families. The most recent example of her work was a year-long, in 2018-2019, panel on race and recovery, which evolved into her nonprofit organization, the Race Recovery Project, a community-based initiative to aid Black Americans to combat the internalized negative effects of racism. Welcome, Dr. Bhembe. Next, I'd like to introduce Ciku Theuri, an associate producer for Here and Now. Before coming to WBUR, Ciku was producer for WGBH's Morning Edition in Boston. She was also a 2016 Roger Sarro Fellow at WFAE in Charlotte, North Carolina, where she produced a local public affairs talk show, Charlotte Talks. Ciku was also an NPR intern before she became a producer at Morning Edition in Washington, D.C. Ciku has a deep passion for shaping conversation to amplify diverse voices, challenge bias, and inform listeners about the world they live in. Welcome, Ciku.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to welcome Tracie Potts, who's senior Washington correspondent for NBC News Channel, the affiliate division of NBC News. Her updates are seen daily on Early Today, CNBC, and more than 150 local affiliates throughout the United States, Canada, Europe, and Asia. Before specializing in political news, Tracie focused on medical research and federal health policy. Prior to NBC, she began her career as a local health reporter at WAFF 48 News in Huntsville, Alabama, and moved to general assignment reporting at WATE-TV in Knoxville, Tennessee. Tracie was a 2017 National Fellow and now a board member with the Center for Health Journalism. Her fellowship project, Forgotten Voices, included 15 reports about the impact of the uncertain future of the Affordable Care Act on families across America. The project was honored with a Dateline Award from the DC chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists. Tracie's been a fellow of the National Press Foundation, the Poynter Institute, and the Journalism Center on Children and Families. She's taught journalism at Knoxville College and Biola University and volunteers with the News Literacy Project. She earned her bachelor's and master's of science degrees from Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now I'd like to introduce our moderator. Tina Martin is Associate Professor of the Practice in Journalism at the College of Communication and an award-winning television and radio reporter and host in Boston. She hosts Local USA, a national television magazine-style series on World Channel Network based at WGBH in Boston. Tina has reported regularly for the WGBH local television program Greater Boston and guest hosts the program Basic Black, an episode of which got her nominated for an Emmy. She's contributed to NPR, PBS NewsHour, KPBS, and WGBY. Among her many honors are a National Endowment for Financial Education RTDNA Award, a Regional Edward R. Murrow Award, 2 National Association of Black Journalists Salute to Excellence Awards, 2 Public Radio News Directors Incorporated Awards, and 8 Telly Awards. In 2018, Tina was inducted into the WERS Hall of Fame by her alma mater, Emerson College, where she studied broadcast journalism. Welcome, Tina, and over to you. Thank you.
Dean Marriott, we really appreciate your support in everything, all of the efforts that we are making here in COM. So you're the best. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
the introduction. We appreciate it. It is my honor, really, to lead this conversation with 3 powerhouse women who I just have so much respect for. Before we all came together, before the guests came together, I was taking selfies on Zoom, just so you guys know, in full disclosure. So, all right, let's start this conversation. For those who don't know, I just wanted to give a little quick context of what's going on in our country. In May, a Black man by the name of George Floyd was arrested in Minneapolis, allegedly using a fake $20 bill to make a purchase. In the process of being in police custody, one of the officers restrained George Floyd with his knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. George Floyd died in police custody that day, caught on video. And there have been other incidences when we talk about Ahmaud Arbery, who was a Black man in Atlanta who was running in February and was shot and killed, and 2 white men have been arrested for his murder. The incident of Chris Cooper, a Black man who was watching birds in Central Park and was called, a white woman named Amy Cooper called the police on him to have him arrested. Her rant was also caught on video. So here we are, as all of those things are happening, protests just start to erupt across the country. And as journalists, we're kind of in the middle of all of that, and we're covering it. Tracie, I want to start with you because you wrote a really thoughtful article for the Center for Health Journalism at University of Southern California. And in that article, you talk about being live covering George Floyd's murder, and a colleague asking you what you thought about what was happening. So I thought it was interesting that first that someone would ask you what you thought in that moment, and then I'll let you take it from there. How did you answer that?
Yeah, it was an odd moment, Tina, because we as journalists, and this is part of what I wrote about, we are trained, you are not the story. You are not the story. And, you know, I've been doing journalism for 30 years, almost 30 years now. And so we tell stories, we feature people, we try to tell balanced stories, objective stories. I'm a live reporter. I do live reports out of the studio every day. So I'm used to wiggling out of those, what do you think kind of questions. This was a little different. It felt different because in that moment, first of all, I had some trust built up with this anchor who asked me. So it wasn't like someone who was just sort of completely out of the blue. I wasn't really suspecting his motives for asking me. But it felt different because I felt compelled to answer the question, whereas normally I would feel compelled to wiggle out of the question. But in that moment, I did not realize that so many things had been building up. And I know Xenia is probably just, you know, as a medical professional is sort of nodding and going, yeah, I know where you were going with this, because so many things have been building up personally as I told these stories. But as I thought about my own personal experiences, as I thought about being the mother of an African-American male, as I thought about experiences that my husband has had with police, I kind of wanted to answer the question in that moment. And there was this internal struggle of, am I an objective reporter who kind of wiggles out of this in the moment, or do I answer? So I answered the question, and I told him, I said, look, you know, I felt like everyone else probably did when they saw that video. I was shocked, and I was angered, and I was hurt, and I was afraid. And what I didn't reveal in that moment, but what I did write about, was the fact that when I saw that video over and over and over again, I saw my son. And I'm sure plenty of other people did as well. I saw my 17-year-old son thinking, you know, what if he were in this situation? That could be him and so many other mothers' sons. So it was an unusual position. It was an unusual feeling, but it sparked this need not only to answer, but to write about it, which is what I think you and many other people reacted to.
And Xenia, I saw you nodding your head when you're listening to Tracie. As that, you know, professional, that mental health professional, what are you thinking about?
Yeah, that's a really powerful statement Tracie makes about having been placed into the story when she's often trying to be outside of the story. And what I thought about as she was describing the encounter was how being Black is often something that's overlooked as well. And it's even much more displaced for journalists who live in a world where they, like therapists and like those of us who sit in a room with the patient, are supposed to be blank slates and not to be seen or influencing in the content. But in those instances, it's very powerful. The content is so powerful that it is hard to stay separate from it. You know, we are transported as those of us who view and who enjoy the narratives of journalism. We are transported into the story by the journalists because of the good skill they have of being distant in that way. But it is vicariously traumatic to be a Black person, to be witnessing such assaults and then having to report on them as if you are unemotional about them, that you are impartial. That's the word I want to come to. So it definitely has a different effect. And then even for the rest of us, those of us who aren't reporting stories, who are just partakers of the narrative, who are partakers of the inundating images of the event, it becomes traumatic as well. And particularly so for those of us who are Black Americans, where the identity of this young man as a Black man resonates highly for us. And the concern I think that starts to elevate then is, where is the level of resonance relative to normal stress and then toxic stress? Have we tipped the scale with this event and these stories, the Ahmaud Arbery's, the Amy Cooper's, the George Floyd's, the Breonna Taylor's? Have we tipped the scale to toxic stress in such a way that not only now are Black Americans resonating and reverberating from that kind of traumatic stress, but the rest of the community as well? And that's a large discussion to have, but it certainly is something I think that Tracie speaks to when she's talking about her response.
And Ciku, I mean, in your role as a producer for Here and Now on NPR, you are not only watching the coverage like all of us, right? Feeling the coverage, having a connection to the coverage, having a, you know, as Xenia said, maybe a traumatic experience due to the coverage or due to the incident. And then you're charged with getting guests into your show, essentially, to discuss these topics. So tell us a little bit about how that process was for you and has been for you.
Oh, sorry, it froze just for a second. So if you could repeat the last part of your question.
Sure. I was asking what has the process been for you trying to get guests onto the show to kind of talk about, you know, everything that Xenia has talked about, everything Tracie has talked about, or has it been pushed back to not have those kind of guests on the show? I mean, we'll ask you.
Yeah. I think it's been sort of a mixed bag in a sense, because there's so many different, angles to this story. And I apologize, there's some noise in the background. But yeah, it's been a bit of both. But I think it's been hard to try to do it thoughtfully and also try to get your voice heard as a producer. You know, I bring some insight as a Black person, as in terms of like how we are to do the story. And, you know, there have been times where myself or another producer like me is, you know, told that, no, actually we want to do it this way. And it can be, you know, challenging to not only cover these stories, but also like have to explain one way to do it versus another, and really try to, you know, get into sort of a debate about that. And that's been somewhat challenging. But it's also been really great to hear from voices that I think we don't hear enough from, right? When we have these moments of racial reckoning, you know, we are having really deep, thought-provoking conversations with people that we probably otherwise wouldn't have spoken to. I remember a segment I produced with Professor Eddie Glaude, and he was just so incredible in the way that he described this moment and how it's different, but also how it's somewhat of the same and very just, you know, in line with what we've seen in America for a long time. So yeah, it's a mixed bag, but it's been challenging to say the least.
And so, Tracie, I'm going to ask you the same. I'm going to ask you just about when Ciku says that it's challenging. Do you feel that in cases like this, do you feel that there is a need to kind of plead your case in terms of the kind of story you want to tell or the kind of way you want to, you know, approach, you know, specific subjects, specifically around racism?
Sometimes. Now, I will say I have not personally had that particular issue since this started. But I do really identify with what Ciku's saying, because oftentimes when I'm teaching and when I'm speaking to young people, I talk to them about bias versus perspective. From a journalistic point of view. So as journalists, you know, the thing that I talked about early on, we want to be very objective because that's our role, that's our job, right? It's not my job to tell you what to think about the news. It's my job to tell you what's happening in the world. But when what's happening in the world is something I can personally connect with, I also feel strongly that it's my job to tell you the things that maybe another reporter might not be able to tell you, because maybe they didn't have that experience. So that's where, to me, perspective is important. It's important to lend that perspective, as Ciku said, you know, in the story development process. And for me, also in the storytelling process. So sometimes there are questions to be asked that a reporter who's not Black may not think to ask, because they didn't have an experience where, you know, their husband was pulled over, or they were in a car and they were pulled over for no reason, or they've had an experience with police or something else. They may just don't have that experience. But I do think it's also our obligation. I look at it like this. People are looking at me on TV. They see I'm Black. It's kind of obvious, right? They know that I'm Black. So it's already obvious that I have a connection to this story. So in a way that does not bias the story, but in a way that adds to the story, I really feel now like it's my obligation to push, to ask those questions and to say, you know, we haven't covered this angle. Let's think about covering this part of the story. As Ciku says, depending on what newsroom you're in, sometimes you are the only Black person in the newsroom. Sometimes you're the only Black person at the decision-making table. You may not be the only one in the newsroom, but you're the only one at the table helping to make those decisions. It can be a bit challenging sometimes to make that push.
And Xenia, I know you and I were talking about that, kind of being that person at the table, that singular voice. And you were saying that it can often, of course, present challenges, and we're talking about our health and well-being. You know, if it's a difficult uphill battle and you're that only voice, what do you do? What is the strategy to keep yourself in some kind of balance where you're not angry or, you know, upset, etc.?
I think, you know, what's interesting about these last 5 years in my work relative to race and race recovery, what I've come to understand is that racism is a distinct entity that gets lost in the idea of white culture. And white culture oftentimes is something that is just as distressing, even without racism. Because what it requires is it requires you to walk into the room and sometimes set aside your Black identity or set aside your racial identity to be able to sit in the table, to sit at the place and begin to have dialogue. Because the common denominator is often something that is very separate from a racial identity that's Black identified. But when you are in those, spaces, it can often feel like you are abandoning a sense of loyalty of self. You sort of escaped or evaded or avoided being true to yourself. But what I recognize, though, is that in those instances, it's really hard to come into a war, and white culture is not a war, but it's sort of in my analogy, if you're walking into a space and you're the only person with the voice that sort of speaks to a particular angle, it might be difficult if you don't have an army behind you supporting you. And so oftentimes we might have our journalists, or we may be in spaces where we feel really bad, or we really kick ourselves because we don't feel like we're speaking up enough. But the truth is, self-preservation and self-protection is priority in those spaces. And sometimes in spaces that maybe even not white, that are not racist, but have dominant white culture, are really, it's safer to really be self-preserving. And then you will know oftentimes when there is a window and opportunity to really step into a space and speak your voice courageously and boldly and safely. And in those moments, we certainly want to take opportunity to do that. But being able to assess a situation accurately is a skill that really is underutilized and under-acknowledged, that we use when we get into these complex bicultural split coding spaces.
Yeah. Can I just add just very briefly to what she said? I so identify with that, because there are definitely things now, 30 years into my career, that I will walk in and I have built those relationships. I think I have built the image and the relationships with my bosses, with my coworkers, that I would not have said 10 years ago, definitely not 20 years ago. So I think that's so applicable to many of us, but especially to our younger and mid-career journalists, right? Because now I'm at a point where in my career where I'm like, okay, well, so I'm Tracie and I'm Black and you already know that. And so here's what I think needs to be covered in this story. But there have been decades of trust and relationship built up to bring me to the point where I feel comfortable doing that. And clearly, that self-preservation piece that you talked about really spoke to me, because I'm sure that Ciku, you could identify with this as well. You walk in and you think, this story isn't sitting right with me. There's a voice missing. There's an angle that we're pursuing that's not quite on. Do I say something? Do I not? And then that decision comes, right? Well, what are they going to think of me? Who do I say it to? How do I say it in a way that I don't get blowback from it? And a lot of our Black journalists are dealing with that. So I just wanted to sort of underscore very much on a practical, everyday level, right? Walking into the newsroom, I think a lot of people could really identify with what you're describing there.
And Ciku, you mentioned a little bit about, some of that blowback. Are there people in the newsrooms where you can identify and say, hey, you know what, maybe I can run this by Joe and he'd be a little bit more receptive than Mary, and maybe I'll have success with him?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Is that kind of a strategy too?
Yeah, that is, I think that's the strategy in any sort of job that you have in journalism, right? You have to identify the people that you trust and that you can run ideas by. You trust their news judgment, you trust their perspective, and they're gonna give you honest criticism and constructive criticism. But yeah, I do have people like that who I run stories by or angles by, and I might be thinking of booking a person, or I might be thinking of tackling an angle of a story, and I just say, hey, what do you think about this? And I find those conversations to be much more helpful than anything else. I've never really had an issue, with those sort of interactions. And it's so helpful. It enriches the idea, the story, and that person might say, well, I don't think that person's a great guest for this particular topic. How about this person? And that's essentially how, you know, we are able to do the best journalism that we can, because we are in conversation about it, and that's part of the process. So.
And so how do you handle those times when you feel like, hey, there is no voice here, in the instance of what Tracie said, we're missing X voice, and X voice never gets in the story. So how do you reconcile that coming in the next day?
Yeah, it's all about picking your battles, I think. And I think I'm always trying to think of, well, how helpful would my criticism be? Because sometimes you can speak up and you are shut down. And at that point, you know, there's not really anything you can do about it. There's a higher power that has overruled you. But, you know, I think if I have a strong case and I, you know, can really articulate why something is problematic or is missing and whatnot, then, you know, I think it's worth mentioning, and I do it with, you know, full confidence, and, you know, I have the, you know, explanation to back it up, and sometimes it's taken really well and sometimes it's not. So, but that's the risk you take, and I think it's better to speak up than not.
And Tracie, would you agree?
I would definitely agree with that. And I think that you have to realize you're walking into that newsroom, and I think Xenia addressed this. Sometimes setting your Blackness aside. I think that was one of the most profound concepts that I thought of. Not that you're physically doing that, not that you're not going to pick it back up, but in that moment, to get that guest on, to get that story angle considered, to get your point across, you feel like you have to be someone else. And I do agree that there is a level of trauma that comes with that when you're doing that over and over and over again. On top of the fact that there's the personal trauma that we're dealing with covering these stories. So as we were, you know, originally talking about the toll of reporting while Black. So for me, my studio is now my home because of COVID-19. And so people think, okay, so you're, you know, I'm not out there covering the riots in the streets, but I'm talking about this stuff, explaining this stuff, being questioned about this stuff over and over and over again, day after day. And I found, in one of the things that I wrote about, Tina, I found myself not even quite yet realizing or identifying the toll that it was having on me. I was talking about my son. He's a new 17-year-old driver, so there's trauma on its own, right? And as this was developing, after the George Floyd video came out, after the protests started, he would say, hey, Mom, can I borrow the keys? I'm going here or there. And I'd start to question him, like, where are you going? How long before you're going to be back? Normal parent questions, but I was doing it more. And I was doing it more intensely. And then one day, this day that I wrote about, I just sat down and cried when he left. I didn't know why I was crying. I mean, he was going to 7-Eleven or something, right? And somewhere in my brain, I'm thinking, what if he doesn't come back, right? What if he ends up being one of the kids, one of the faces on the news? What if he ends up in that list of Breonna Taylors and you know, Ahmaud Arbery's and George Floyd's, and you know, it was overwhelming. And my thought was, that was already in there, right? It came out at that moment, but it was in there, and it's in there when I go on air every day to talk about these things. And I think that's the trauma that we just first need to recognize is there.
I can relate to that as well. You know, I'm not a mother, so I can't imagine what kind of, you know, worry that brings, but you know, I was the same age as Breonna Taylor when she was killed in her apartment, and I just moved into an apartment in March, and I couldn't help but think, like, that could easily be me. And you know, I'm writing a script about her, and there's absolutely no reason that my colleagues could be writing the same script about me next week. And that is such a sobering kind of reality. It weighs on you, and it's hard to work through while you're on the job and when you're not on the job too. It's certainly heavy.
And can I say something a bit about racial trauma? And certainly it lies on this continuum between PTSD, which is frank, threatening, life-ending trauma exposure, and then sort of mild stressors. Racial trauma really is something that I think we are just becoming much more aware of as a clinical entity. It's been talked about for years, but the narrative around this being something that is a lived experience, not just in the extremes, but in the gray areas, is something that's becoming much more a point of conversation these days. And one of the things I'd like to really sort of highlight is that there are ways in which we all see these elements of racial trauma in our lives every day. For instance, when you've ever heard someone say, "Why do you always talk about race?" Well, when you're always talking about race, or when you feel as if someone around you is always talking about race, that's very similar to what happens with someone with PTSD, where they're reliving a traumatic memory to undo and to redo, to try to reconstruct it in a way that actually comes out with a better ending. So in some respects, that is a traumatic symptom. Or when you see individuals and you say, "Oh, they don't show any emotion, like nothing really bothers them," or they're very angry, that something always pisses them off. Well, those are also traumatic symptoms. And I think what's gotten lost in a lot of the broader dialogue has been that these real presentations that people bring into our office spaces, bring into the journal work, bring into our therapy spaces, are actually symptoms of an entity that has been enduring for generations and continues to endure and present itself in lives to this day. So what would be really great for us all to begin to recognize, Blacks, whites, every corporate, academic, clinical, is that these subtle symptoms actually are indications of stresses that lie somewhere between mental illness, but wellness on the other end of it.
So when we talk about wellness, because we are talking about self-care and that kind of thing, what are some of the ways that we can stay well, so that we can stay in these newsrooms and we can still contribute, and we can do it in a positive and productive way? Xenia, we'll let you start.
You wanted me to start? I have such a loaded answer for that. I thought I would go last. Well, so I will tell you my loaded answer. Okay. For Black journalists and for Black individuals who are living in an era where the risk of being Black, it seems heightened, right? The idea of what happens to you, like Tracie was saying, when her son goes out driving, or when you think about moving into a new apartment, and what is the likelihood of the risk that presents itself to you because you're Black. It really is, it requires you to kind of recalibrate what wellness is and how you do wellness. One of the things that I think is central in the idea of how we navigate the world as Black individuals is the sense of identity. And identity is something really nuanced in some respects, right? Because it can be individual for each of us. It can be, oh, well, I like dancing, or I like drawing, or I like fashion, and I like art. But the Black identity really requires you to begin to move from a place of being immersed and sort of overtaken in your definition of self by white culture, which is very easy to do because everything that has been established in an American society has been established as a white norm. And so it's very hard to live apart from that, or to begin to define yourself apart from that. But Black identity, apart from a sense of being immersed in a white culture, is a very positive step towards wellness. And I would say, as the race recovery expert, I would say that is actually probably the first place to begin to distinguish how you see yourself as an identified individual with some wellness. And then what I might also say is then there are these number of things that we do that run past into journalism, but outside of journalism as well, that are very useful, where you build community. Because we also know that identity is reinforced when you have community behind you. People who might be able to offer constructive criticism, but who also able to just see you, to where you are visible in your opinions, in your values, in your patterns and your practices and habits, that those things really start to become a norm, and you don't have to fight against another norm to present them. So that's really important. The other thing I like to do, and this is my three F's, I like to start by saying, how do you fill your day? So that I think each of us each day should have 3 things that we prioritize. How do you fill your day? What's the first thing you do? To sort of set up a tone for yourself around how you are going to show up in the world and show up as an empowered individual in the world? Whether that's visualization, whether that's meditation, whether that's prayer, beginning a day in the day in a way where you begin to capture the idea and the image of yourself in that day. And then the next thing is to flush yourself. What are you flushing out? What are the things you're getting rid of? What are the things you need to discard? What are the things you need to put apart, you put aside? Whether it's a story from the other day, whether it's the inundation of media images that you need to sort of separate yourself from, what are you needing to flush, and being deliberate about flushing that? And then finally, the flow. What are the ways in which you step into a purposeful and deliberate, active life for yourself for the next 24 hours? How do you determine that, and how do you move into that? Those are wellness things that really start to, after developing community, defining identity, really help you maintain wellness.
Xenia, I just have to tell you, I think I was doing the 3 F's and didn't realize it. So now at least I can put a label on it.
There you go.
and I can so identify with what you're saying, because as I think back now, I am starting my day more deliberately, in a much more meditative state, I guess you could say. For me, it's prayer. For, like you said, for somebody it could be something else. But I find that it's my mindset goes into that day very differently, and it's very helpful. And then the other thing that you said, flushing. So my home studio is in the basement. And when I close that door at 10 a.m., because I work the overnight shift, I do early mornings, I come upstairs, and typically my husband's a news junkie, which is kind of good and kind of bad for me, because I come upstairs and he's watching all the news. I'm like, yeah, I saw that. I already know that. I saw that all morning. But I have to shut it off. I really have to shut it off so that I know I have a life that's different and distinctly separate from all that stuff that I've been talking about. Not that it doesn't exist. It's going to be there for me tomorrow, right? And it's a weird thing for a journalist to do, because, and Shaiko, I know you can identify with this. We're supposed to know everything that's happening at every moment. Our phone is buzzing, right? We're getting constant updates. And then our friends are asking us, what's the latest? Like, what's going on? Like, what's the scoop on this? So you really do have to draw those lines in your life. And I have found for myself, I have to draw them very distinctly. I have to tell you, when the George Floyd video first came out, it was a minute before I could watch it. And then as we started to see different, the body cam video and different versions, like, I took a beat and I said to myself, Tracie, it's okay if you don't watch this within the first 30 seconds, 5 minutes, 15 minutes, maybe even the first half a day that it comes out. Like, get yourself together, because you know that you're going to have an emotional reaction to this. So take a beat and then watch it when you're ready. And that's a hard thing for a journalist to do, because we feel like we're supposed to be on top of everything immediately. But I'm a person first, and that's part of for me, that was part of self-care.
Yes.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to all of that. I did want to talk about the community part, because I think that is so crucial, and I feel like it's helped me so much in just finding sort of commonality, especially when you're working in a newsroom that's very white, and a lot of people don't understand how you feel. The way in which we're talking about these very serious issues can sometimes be disrespectful, and it kind of, they're not spoken about in a serious manner in certain instances. So it is nice to be able to relate to other journalists, other Black journalists who experience the same thing, and also seeing Black journalists who I may or might not know on Twitter expressing how they feel as well, just being so open about their struggle and the fact that they have to take breaks, and they need community, and they're forming their own communities. That's so encouraging, and it's really nice to know that like you're not alone in this.
And Ciku, I know that you were talking about, we were talking earlier about taking a look at the tape and, just kind of allowing yourself to be a human looking at it, right? Because we get into this sometimes, this journalistic, I'm a journalism robot and I just have to, block stuff out and just do my job. But, it's very hard. And particularly in this case, it's almost impossible.
Right. Yeah. I think I was in denial about the way it was impacting me for a while. I never really came to terms with my feelings until maybe a month later. And I realized I need to slow down, and I need to just sit in my thoughts and process my thoughts, because I was just so on all the time. CNN would run up until bedtime, and then I'd be on Twitter like right after I wake up, and it's not healthy. And so I am trying to set sort of boundaries for myself. Tracie mentioned closing that door and kind of shutting off the news for a second, and I'm trying to somewhat do the same. I turn my phone off before I go to bed, and I try to read a book so that I can immerse my mind in something else other than what's going on right now. So yeah, but it can be really challenging to have to, work through your feelings and then get up the next day and be bombarded by it again, because it's your job, right? And you have to be so, in it and present and just very on it all the time. So it's important to set those boundaries.
And then the other part of that is having conversations with, your colleagues, maybe in the newsroom, maybe not necessarily. When you're a journalist, I know that you've both experienced this. People kind of just want to talk to you about stuff, right? They want to get your take on it. And, so I want to just throw this out there. The conversation that someone would have with you who says, well, all lives matter, not just Black lives. What are those conversations like?
I'm going to jump in. I'm not a journalist on this one. Jump in. I think it's a bit of a loaded statement, because the truth is, if that is indeed the intended message that all lives matter, then the assaults to Black life would get as much attention, if not more attention, than what we're seeing, because Blacks are included in all. But when we look back over the history of this country, all has not always included Blacks. Liberty and justice for all did not include Blacks. When the Constitution was written, all did not include Blacks. So there are ways in which all has never necessarily been synonymous with an inclusion of Black people. So the idea of all lives matter, if in truth, if that is really truth, I think we can all stand behind that. The problem is when Black lives seem to be in competition with all lives. And that's the problem that we start to have with that.
Tracie, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so to the, all lives matter. So to that point, my initial thought is always, I'm not sure that anybody disagrees with that, that all lives matter. So if you see a life that clearly didn't seem to matter, then we all should want to speak up and say, hey, that's not right. That's wrong. Or we need to ask some questions about what happened there until we know, what the full story is. I just find it disingenuous when people say all lives matter, but they don't want to speak about the ones that are in jeopardy, right? If there are lives so I heard somebody explain it this way. So I'm full of old Bible stories, so I'll throw this one out because people have often heard of the 99 sheep and the one that went, or the 100 sheep and the one that went astray, right? And the 99 were left to go after the one. It wasn't that people didn't care about the 99. It wasn't in that case that Jesus didn't care about the 99. The one was the one that was in trouble. So that was the one that needed the focus at that moment. And so in response to All Lives Matter, my thought is, which life needs the focus at this moment that doesn't seem to matter?
And as a journalist, how do you get that point? How do you tell the story so that that is understood more clearly?
So there's the challenge.
Yes.
There's the challenge. And I'm not sure that we always have the full or the right answer for that. One thing that I have tried to, I love storytelling. That's how I got into this. I'll tell anybody's story. Black, white, red, blue, or green. I love telling stories. And I think we find that when we tell people stories, not always, but more often it's easier to connect, right? When we get down to telling the individual story of a person's life, like who was that person? What was important about, what will that person's friends and family remember about him or her? Sometimes some of the racial overtones fall away, not always and not for everyone, realistically. But as a journalist, I think that the storytelling of that one individual life is sometimes a strategy that we can use. It's a strategy that I have used at times to try to really bring focus to that life that mattered.
Ciku?
Yeah, I think it's about restoring the humanity, like Tracie said, by, relating to someone's story, because we all in some way, have similar experiences. We struggle and we have experienced love and whatnot. And I think by having, highlighting that of a person can really help someone, recognize the humanity in someone else.
Can I offer one last thing as well around the All Lives Matter point, is that it's almost also censorship. It's this subtle way of saying there's certain conversations that we are not going to have. And when you think about how censorship has been played out throughout ages, you're looking back to the 17th and 18th centuries, when certain conversations, and at this point it wasn't white and black, it was really certain conversations around class were allowed or not allowed. And that in a democratic society, that is not the way of balance. That's not the way of equality. That is a way of tyranny, to suggest that one conversation is a conversation that has to be elevated and promoted. And if All Lives Matter only means we can't talk about Black lives, then that's censorship.
I just want to remind everyone who is on with us that you can ask questions. The Q&A is open, so please feel free to send questions, and I will make sure that our panelists answer your questions to the best of all of our ability. I wanted to talk about well, geez, we only have so much time, but let's talk about something very quickly. When, Tracie, you saw, was it Omar from CNN being arrested in Minnesota, what went through your mind? Because at that same time, when he did an interview shortly thereafter, he said that his white colleague was just checked on by police and they said, okay, you're good. And he was arrested on live TV.
Right. And it was a scary thing to see, right? Because just like the experience that I had with George Floyd and the video on my son, I thought I could be out there. That could be me. The guy's doing his job. And how is he doing it any differently than anyone else? But I remember I was also looking around at the reaction of the police to his colleagues, right? And I'm looking around because typically you don't have one news crew out covering something like that. They're all over. They're kind of, we congregate. And I'm like, where are the other news crews? Like, where are the other people being harassed? Like, where are the other people being arrested? So that was initially my thought. And then, also, and Xenia, you may be able to speak to this, the incredible on live television. I mean, the conversation that I had on live television just sort of took me aback. No one has ever put me in handcuffs on live television. The amount of personal restraint it takes to, what are you balancing in that moment? You're balancing, I'm a Black man being arrested for, I'm not quite sure what I did wrong, because he was clearly being very cooperative in the moments before that. And then you're balancing, I'm on live TV, I'm doing my job. How do I continue to do my job? Do I continue to tell the story? Do I kind of just fall into what's happening here and let the moment tell itself? There's a lot of stress and trauma in that moment, and I thought about that.
It's very hard not to get dehumanized in those moments and to respond in a way that it feels like you are rescuing your humanity, to get enraged, to be sort of become boisterous. You know, it's in those instances where you watch that, where you see this playing out, you can understand then why someone might get very combative if they're feeling like they're being arrested improperly outside of those kinds of situations. So your dignity is at stake, you know, your well-being is at stake. And so you fight for that. But I think what is very important to keep in mind oftentimes, and I don't think that anyone really necessarily unpacks this in the way that it would be useful, is really to understand that what you are playing out, what is playing out in that scenario is not necessarily you against the other person or your dignity against the other person. It is a system of power playing out in its mechanisms of restraint. And if you understand the injustice of that, as unjust as it is, you can step out of it being about dignity and respect and being about a dysfunction of a system and being able to then restrain yourself and step into a different mechanism of management of self in those moments.
We do have a question. I want to make sure that I get to these questions. Sarah says, what can journalism schools do better to train young journalists entering the field at this time?
I wanted to weigh in on that. I saw that because the first thing I thought was bring yourself and bring who you are to the table from the jump, right? Well, I think we can do a better job of training young journalists the difference in, as I said earlier, bias and perspective, and that it's okay to bring your Blackness to the table, right? It's okay to be a Black reporter and to bring that perspective to the table. And it should not take you 10 or 20 years, as it took me, to sort of build up the courage and the relationships and the trust and the know-how of how to do that. I would love to see journalism schools, which are now so much more multicultural, right? We're approaching things from such a wider viewpoint than we were when I was in school, you know, several decades ago. I would love to see them teaching young journalists that it is part of your job, and you do your job better when you bring all of your perspectives, including your Blackness, including me being a female, right? All of that to the table helps you tell the stories better.
Excellent. All right, we have more. Okay, how do we get to a place of real equity in newsrooms, considering most newsrooms are, newsroom leaders are almost always white? What does it take to see real change?
Well, I think we have to start with who's in charge, right? Who are the people making the decisions, hiring, and there need to be more people of color in those positions. Because at the end of the day, I mean, you could go to a million different conventions and try to seek different ways in how you can, you know, hire more people of color in your newsroom, without really understanding the value of that beyond the cosmetic sort of, you know, quota check. And, you know, like Tracie said, I think asserting as a journalist in the newsroom, asserting the fact that you're not here just to, you know, add color, I guess, to the newsroom. You're here to also bring the perspectives that come with that, and that enriches that. And, you know, people who are of color know this. This is something that, you know, is kind of a no-brainer. And so I think we do need more people of color at the top making these decisions, and it'll enrich not only the way newsrooms look, but also the way that the content is created and doing more comprehensive journalism in the end.
And just briefly to add to that, Tina, if I can, I know we want to get to all the other questions. Not just that concept of diversity, right, but the concept of inclusion, that I'm just not here to be a Black face, but I'm actually here to be heard. And that doesn't always mean that the story that I suggest gets done, but it does mean that I'm part of the conversation, and that I'm taken seriously. And I think that takes not only, as the previous question addressed, what can we do to encourage young journalists, but that takes a real commitment at the top, right? That takes a commitment from newsroom leaders to set the environment so that people feel comfortable bringing their Blackness to the table, right? That some people will feel comfortable, many will not. So I think newsroom leaders, Black, white, whatever color, whatever backgrounds we come from, have to recognize the importance of making that a comfortable thing to do.
Might I offer something as well, Tina? One of the things that I also do in my race recovery role is workplace wellness, racial wellness. And one of the things that I've been able to ascertain over examining a number of different corporations and organizations is that the places that actually tend to be able to navigate racial culture successfully, one, honor a buddy system. So Black individuals are paired with a white individual who becomes their advocate, not just their ally, but actually stands in a way where they support ideas that they present, and they promote and support the promotion of this individual into the climate of leadership for the system. The other thing that I begin to understand about workplace wellness is that there needs to be a space where Blacks or people of color have conversations that are separate but also equal, meaning that they are free to have sort of unpack dialogue, unpack ideas, unpack narratives that then become part of the storyline that is untainted or it isn't threatened by the CEO, or I'm not sure what you call the newsroom director in the space, that it's authentic and it's a genuine idea that comes with its own perspective, and then it gets promoted as an idea and a storyline just as any other storyline would. And those are the places where I find that racial wellness, it's a tongue twister, racial wellness actually works really well, whether it's journalism, whether it's medicine, whether it's corporate America.
All right. Shanta asks, Kamala Harris has been selected as Joe Biden's vice president. That was breaking news today. As Black journalists, will her selection shape or change your coverage? How should Black journalists bring their full selves to the table? That's two different questions, but I want to throw something in there as well. We have seen the current president boldly attack all kinds of journalists, but particularly Black journalists. I remember the president's back and forth on numerous occasions with Yamiche Alcindor from PBS NewsHour. So I want to ask you that. Of course, you know, Kamala Harris is going to be, she's a Black woman, but also there is a sentiment of a seemingly negative sentiment towards Black women as it relates to being journalists. So do you think that having a Kamala Harris potentially as a vice president will kind of shift the tides a different way?
So I'm in Washington, I cover politics, so I'll take that one. I'll take it first. Feel free to jump in. But I think that Kamala Harris is going to bring her story to the table. She's going to do that because initially she wants people to know who she is. She ran a campaign. She was one of the earlier ones to jump out. And so there's going to be a reintroduction of Kamala Harris, and the media is going to jump on that. So we're going to hear about her parents' background. We're going to hear that story again where she kind of went after Joe Biden in the Miami debate about, you know, I was that kid. We're going to hear that. So part of our role is going to be to showcase and to report on the things that she brings to the table, because she wants people to know who she is. And I think early on, that's a lot of what we're going to see.
Ciku, do you want to add anything to that before we?
I think she said it best.
Okay, so is there a newsroom or a program that's providing a good model in your opinion? I would imagine that's for, you know, people, as you said, Tracie, to bring their full selves to the table, to really contribute, to really be included in their newsroom. Is there an ideal, you know, model right now, do you think? Any stations come to mind?
Well, I can tell you what I've experienced at NBC. One of the things, and I think all companies, you know, I know many obviously, but many companies have affinity groups, right, for Black employees to talk, to have luncheons, to have coffee chats. Of course, we're doing it all virtually now. But my feedback has been very helpful and useful for the Black employees at my network. I literally just signed up for like 3 things today that I'm looking forward to, because that's that community that Ciku was talking about, right? Right in your, it may not be in your newsroom, but it's part of your company. That's building community so that we can talk out these experiences that we're having and how they're having an impact on the coverage that we do.
Does anybody else want to chime in on that?
Yeah, I think NPR, like informally, we do have a collective of Black journalists and journalists of color who are very much connected to each other, and we're having, you know, conversations all the time about our coverage, the culture, and that has been helpful. But I think in this moment of reckoning for newsrooms across the country, it's interesting to see just how much work we have to do and just how far we have to go. You know, the starting line of where we're even beginning is much further back than I think we ever realized. And it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this moment, you know, 5-10 years from now.
All right, time is leaving us here, but we have a question from Ann Donahue, who is our former Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion for COM. Hi, Ann. All right, she says, how do you balance bringing your Blackness to the newsroom versus being the go-to person / expert to answer all questions regarding all Black people?
I will tell you, I speak up. I say, look, this is what I think. Like, I'm not the voice for the Black community. I think that is a way to minimize trauma, right? Because a lot of times, if you're the only, or if you're one of the few people, I work in the newsroom, and my producer's not here, but she would probably laugh hearing me say this. She and I are the only African-American editorial people in the small newsroom that we work in. And we often have very different opinions on things. Sometimes I'll go to her because I know she's going to think very differently about something, and it's going to open my thoughts about how to address something. And I tell people all the time, well, you know, you might want to ask her, because she may say something completely different than I do. Because I think there's an education about that, you know, you're just not going to always get the same opinion because we have, you know, we're of the same race. People know that, but in the moment they don't always, you know, it's just not always evident to folks. So I do try to speak up and say, I am just speaking for me here.
Yeah, I also try to speak up as well, but I'm learning to draw the line as well when I'm asked questions or consulted about, you know, what I think about certain things. You know, I don't get paid extra to do that sort of work, and it's also not necessarily my job, but I do also recognize that I'm part of the solution, but I'm also trying to balance, you know, my well-being and my time as well.
Xenia, do you want to chime in on that? Because that can be exhausting if you're all of a sudden the voice of all Black folk everywhere all the time, especially in a newsroom situation.
Yeah, and I think that just coming into the room and being yourself, being able to stand authentically and truthfully and strongly in your voice is enough representation of Black folk that it can be a heterogeneous image for people. And you can say that I stand in my voice just like other Blacks stand in their voice.
All right, one more question, and then it's 6:04. I'm trying to be respectful of time here. From your experiences, do you detect a difference in newsrooms before President Trump versus the era we're in now? Example, the stories that are covered, issues that are raised. Who wants to take that?
That's a loaded last question.
Yeah.
I will say this, there is just a whole new focus on fact checking now, right? Because of the way that this administration has developed. in terms of, I almost feel like we're kind of on a roller coaster sometimes, covering the very fast moving developments. You know, things come out in tweets and they're considered as policy and things like that. The fact checking aspect, though, is what really stands out to me as something that, and while that may not be so much of a racial issue, it for me has been the issue in covering this administration.
I think we've become more pointed with, or trying to be more thoughtful with our language in terms of how we talk about racism. I think before we sort of were approaching it with this haphazard kind of, you know, way, and now we're, you know, really looking and examining certain words that weren't necessarily useful, you know, to advance the conversation, right? To really examine ourselves and what our leaders say. So I think we've become much more, you know, aware and I think critical of the way that we're using language.
All right, Tracie, so you've convinced me. We have one last question that's a better ending question, okay? All right, in some states, racism is identified as a public health crisis. Given this information, what resources should newsrooms have for Black journalists and other journalists of color to ensure that their wellness comes first so they can do their job? That sounds like a question for Dr. Bhembe.
Yes. So Harvard actually has an implicit bias screening tool. I might say that that is an important thing to add into the lexicon and the procedures of any newsroom, of any corporation, to be honest with you. It's not in total a comprehensive tool, but it's certainly a place to start, because then it allows you, even I've taken it. It isn't just for people who might not identify as people of color. It's for anyone to really identify your own biases and where you might, in some respects, really sway in a particular unobjective way. The other things that I might offer, which we are developing now, the Race Recovery Project, is a cultural harm tool. And a cultural harm tool means a way of screening engagement in the workplace that actually imposes cultural harm, that feels like it actually no longer is a healthy space, but a harmful space. And I think oftentimes we can go into an organization with really good intentions because we're very well skilled and we're very well meaning, but also producing and imposing cultural harm or harmful agents into a cultural space. And so there are screeners that we potentially could use for that to be able to allow us. And then, as I mentioned earlier, just being able to be aware of some of the nuances around what racial trauma may look like. You talk about race too much, you're not really emotional, you're just too emotional, you seem to be sort of fatigued or agitated all the time. While these may be things that you can actually function in, right? We can go to work and still be a little bit irritable. We can go to work and still need to talk about race. Those things for everyone in the racial in the work culture are important to know, might be indications of a person who is enduring more stressor related to race than they should be.
Does anybody want to chime in here? I think Dr. Bhembe said it best. Thank you, ladies. This has been such a pleasure. It is past 6 o'clock, and I didn't mean to hold you and our attendees. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Tracie Potts from NBC, Dr. Xenia Bhembe from Harvard University, Ciku Theuri from Here and Now on NPR, and of course, our wonderful Dean, Mariette DiChristina, and Emma, who is behind the scenes, and Allison, who's behind the scenes, Sarah, Jen Underhill. We really appreciate all of your help. Ermelande Jean Simone, who keeps us going with diversity and inclusion here at Boston University. We appreciate you so much. Our chair of journalism department, Bill McKean, and Donahue, we really appreciate you. Professor Michelle Johnson, if you are there, we appreciate you watching as well. Have a great night. Thank you so much. And we hope that, this was insightful, and I certainly learned a lot, and it was a very thoughtful conversation. So thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.